Before I start pointing my fingers and setting the record straight, I think there's some common ground to be found between all reasonable, peace-loving people, regardless of where they find themselves on the political spectrum. The farthest left, the farthest to the right, or anywhere in between. Most people have a deep and legitimate concern as to where things are heading. And I shouldn't say heading. Everything is being brought to this point, pushed in this direction. None of it is happening organically. And I don't think that anyone, again, regardless of where they find themselves on that political spectrum, takes a look around at the world and thinks that this is the natural order, that things are going this way because it's in human nature for us to behave that way, even though they've taught us these things relentlessly. It's the nature of man to stab his neighbor's eye just for whatever, for no reason whatsoever. We're just violent. It's our primitive past, and it's part of who we are. Of course, they want to teach us that and convince us of it so that we don't look at or look in their direction or look outside of ourselves for a reason, for an explanation, to have an understanding of why these things are taking place. But I think it's clear by now to most people that them and they are manufacturing these problems. That there's a whole lot of violence, chaos, death, and destruction in this dog-eat-dog world that is completely unnecessary and, again, fabricated. That the people in power, that the powers that be, are seeing to it that these things happen. That they're lying to us constantly. And I think most people also understand that you look to the top for blame when it comes to placing blame. Who's signing the checks? Who's giving the orders? Who's providing the incentives? Who's telling the lies? Who's creating this environment and this situation and pushing all of these things forward, painstakingly, deliberately making these things happen? What I'm trying to get at here, aside from establishing some common ground between all the peasants, all the people, is I'm trying to make an assessment, to tell you the truth, as far as where public sentiment is at, where John Doe is at in his mind at this point in time as he's sitting on his couch and making an assessment of the world around him and his future prospects. And I think if you go back 10 years or beyond, the average person in the West was relatively comfortable. He knew there were some problems, some corruption or whatnot, but it wasn't anything that was out of our control. It wasn't anything that couldn't be fixed, if not by us, then by Jesus, right? Somebody somewhere was going to come save the day for us. The good guys always win, and all this other stuff that they teach us and convince us of. There's someone there taking care of things. Just go vote, right? And your politicians will make these things right. The last ones didn't, but the next crop will, and they promise, right? So anyways, there's always been this sense of everything's going to be okay. And obviously, the powers that be have a vested interest to convince us of such things so that we sit back and allow them to do to us as they please, to slowly turn the water up, and the froggies will not jump in that situation. But looking at things now, I think the average person in just that short span of time, relatively short span of time, has been violently shaken into reality to understand that nothing is promised, nothing is guaranteed, and not that many things are really all that good at this point, and they're getting worse. We're lost in a sea of craziness and chaos and violence and destruction. If it hasn't reached our doorsteps yet, it's on its way. And I think most people are aware of that at this point in time. So we don't have to convince people anymore that things are wrong and that they're getting worse. Most people see it. There's a healthy amount of fear in the average sheep today that all we're left to do, or the main thing we should be focusing on as far as waking them up, is letting them know who is responsible. That is, it is their intent to do all of these things. Again, none of it's happening in a vacuum. Of course, beyond that awakening, we have a lot of work to do, but I'm just talking about waking people up. They need to be made aware of the fact that all of this stuff is being done on purpose with the most malicious of intent. And while that might sound obvious, even to most people at this point in time, if you go back just a few short years ago, if you were aware then and trying to make other people aware, you would know just how difficult it was when they didn't even know that there was something wrong in the first place. But now that people understand, that they can't just walk away from it or get away from it, run away from it, white flight or whatnot. There's no escaping it, that it's going to follow them wherever they're at, and things are only going to get worse. It leaves us with a clear and relatively simple, I'm not going to say easy, but it's a straightforward task of simply making them aware of who is responsible for everything that is taking place on their watch. That is the main point here. It is all taking place on their watch. So they are ultimately responsible. None of this stuff is happening against their wishes. It is all happening due to their will to make it happen. And that's exactly what they've been doing. So we need to make people aware, not that something's wrong, they know it by now, but we need to let them know who is truly responsible. And it's certainly not the Nazis. And as I'm going to start pointing my fingers here again, I will say what I've always said and always suggested. Don't take my word on anything. Look it up. Look all of it up. Who prints the money? Look it up. Who monopolizes our media? Look it up. Who produces all of the propaganda? Look it up. Who writes our laws? Who opens our borders? Who is grabbing for our guns? Who controls the medical industry? Who orchestrated the slave trade? And I don't say that because it's of any great importance to any of us alive today, but because it's used against us to silence us, to weigh us down with false guilt, and to radicalize blacks against us. But it's just one of many points, one of many crimes, one of endless projections. Who starts the wars? Who poisons our everything? Who is making thought a crime? Who suppresses our speech? Who has murdered us by the tens of millions several times before? And who wants to wipe us off the face of the earth? Again, it's all happening on their watch. The debt, the destruction, the debauchery, the displacement of our people, the pollution, the poisoning of our everything, the endless wars, and then some. And it's not even up for debate. They don't even deny their control, their complicity, or their malicious intent. They simply attack the messengers. Their control over everything and everyone is obvious. And there's no shortage of Jews bragging about their control, essentially bragging out their confessions. They simply believe that we're too blind to see any one of them anywhere doing any of these things, that we're too stupid to do the simple arithmetic, to add it all up, to understand that they're all working in unison and that they've been doing so for generations now. And they know that we're too powerless, at least at this point, to do anything about it even after we wake up. Still, as obvious as it is, as out in the open as they are, they will continue to blame the Nazis, who were bombed, defeated, and slaughtered 3/4 of a century ago. There are no Nazis to be found, at least not here in reality. They're on television all the time, so much so that they are constantly in the minds of the average person, of the lemmings. But again, here in reality, the so-called Nazis, the last people who stood up against these Jew bastards, were defeated, going on a century ago. But yet, all we ever hear about are Nazis. Nazis everywhere. Nazis are hiding in your closets. Nazis are just waiting to spring up into action and genocide Jews and non-whites. Every white, in fact, is a Nazi, a closet Nazi, a potential Nazi, and needs to be dealt with. That's how far they've taken this narrative. So the lemmings will go right along with this ridiculous, unfounded narrative, and all a Jew has to stand up and do is scream out, "Nazi!" and point his finger at you, and these lemmings will come after you. If not screaming and yelling and attacking you with words, than with physical violence, as these social justice warrior, Antifa, Black Lives Matter, and all these other lemmings are doing at the behest and on behalf of the Jew, mindlessly and violently doing their bidding. Did you vote for Trump? Then you're a Nazi. Are you aware of any one thing that any Jew has ever done? Then you're an anti-Semitic Nazi, to be sure. Are you white? Then you're a Nazi. And I don't care how outlandish that might have sounded to someone a few years ago. If you haven't been living in a bubble, and if you've been paying attention to the mainstream narrative at all, to include their movies and propaganda coming from all directions, their lessons that they teach us from kindergarten all the way through grad school, they have now taken things so far that all white people are closet racists, and i.e., eventually they're calling us all Nazis. And what do you need to do with a Nazi? Well, in the video games, you shoot them and kill them. They're just Nazis after all, the characters in the video games. Anyone who's aware, or once more, to make this point clear to all of you who have somehow missed it, all white people are being made out to be at least potential Nazis. And what do you do with a Nazi? You punch them, right? You punch them, you punish them, and ultimately you put them to death. You know, if the world hadn't been completely turned upside down, and if these peace-loving, liberal-minded hippie leftists simply knew the truth, they should and would go after those who are truly responsible for all of the hatred and all of these problems, instead of going on their witch hunt after the actual victims. The victims Jews falsely label as Nazis, white supremacists, hateful, racist, and privileged, among many other things, while projecting their power and perversions onto us. But these sheep are too blinded by their hatred to open their eyes and too weak of mind to question their current state of mind, so that leaves the Jews in a position where they are not being held accountable for anything they have done or are actively and openly doing to us now, where all of their hatred and all of the things that they're doing gets projected onto us, their greatest victims, the people who they've been going after and mass murdering all this time, as they're stepping aside and pointing their finger at us and projecting all of that onto us. Once more, it's all happening on their watch. What else do they need to control before you understand that they have the power? The better question is, what don't they have control over? What could be more important than printing the money, monopolizing the media, controlling the politicians? You just look into these things. Look it up. They control it all. You tell me what they don't control. And if it really were a white supremacist system, then none of you would have any problem whatsoever blaming that white supremacist system and whites as a whole. And in fact, even when and every time a non-white does something now that's wrong within that system, you still blame that white supremacist system. These non-whites can do no wrong. It's not their fault. Why? Because you believe that the system is controlled by white supremacists, that there's systemic racism everywhere, and therefore these people are not to be held accountable, or as accountable as they otherwise would be. And I want to make sure I'm being redundantly crystal clear in making this point. Now that most people, the lemmings, the average person, the sheep, and specifically the social justice warriors, the Antifa, these people wholeheartedly believe that it is a white supremacist system. There's nothing to support that. In fact, there's evidence everywhere that it is anything but a white supremacist system. But let's go along with that logic for just a moment. It is a white supremacist system, therefore non-whites are not to be held as accountable. as whites themselves, who have privilege and everything else. Everything's going for them. They're given a leg up. They're not treated unfairly. They're never mistreated by cops or whatnot. And all of the racism is directed at non-whites because the system itself is controlled by whites, right? So therefore, in that logic, along that line of erroneous thinking, it's just completely fabricated. It's projected onto whites. It's a complete reversal of roles and flipping of the script. But nevertheless, you believe it's a white supremacist system, therefore you sympathize with and just about excuse every criminal behavior, criminal act that they engage in, because you believe it to be a white supremacist system. And because you believe it to be a white supremacist system, you blame all whites, or you hold them accountable, and you suggest that they are all benefiting from that white supremacist system. But here in reality, on the other end of that, you will never hold Jews to that same logic or level of accountability, and you certainly wouldn't condemn them, because it is a Jewish supremacist system, and it does direct all of its energies towards destroying whites and everything that we built, and destroying us as a people. But no free passes for whites, no sympathy, no anything. And certainly no accountability for these Jews who have created this system, told these lies, projected their behavior and their criminality and their agenda onto the very people they are victimizing. So while you believe it's a white supremacist system, you will hold all whites accountable. You're going to look at the top and you're going to blame people from the top down. But when it comes to Jews, it's a completely different set of standards. When it comes to what's real here, Jewish power, Jewish supremacism, and Jewish privilege, it's all of a sudden wrong to generalize. You will say, well, and many people say this, it's not just Jews. Even when they're forced to admit that one Jew over there might sort of kind of be guilty of something. They're quick to point out that it's not all Jews. That's just one bad Jew apple in a giant white bunch. Is essentially what they are telling you in not so many words. And it's just never their fault. Furthermore, and to take this point, take it home, right? And make sure that everyone is crystal clear on this. Applying that same systemic racism and blame game logic from this non-existent white power system to the reality of Jewish power, when it comes to the motivations given to and the actions consequently taken by Gentiles, suddenly the top-down approach for holding people accountable becomes void, invalid, racist, and anti-Semitic. Once more, if you look at corruption, corporate corruption or whatnot, the CEO is the first person you look to blame, rightfully so. Any reasonable person would do so. You're not talking about one person within that company doing something that is beyond anyone else's control. You're talking about systemic violations, systemic whatever's going on, criminality, right? You're going to look to the top and hold him accountable. He's the one signing the checks. He's the one giving the orders. He's the one making it all possible, providing these people with the incentives, or in the very least, turning a blind eye as they're doing these things. So, of course, he's going to be held accountable. But when it comes to Jews, it's suddenly irrelevant, and anti-Semitic. Never mind the fact that all these Gentiles are operating within that Jew-controlled system. They're Shabbos Goy, essentially. Military personnel, law enforcement officers, you name it. Essentially, anyone who's working within this system right now is a Shabbos Goy. They're useful idiots on a need-to-know basis. But if they're still doing the Jews' bidding, then they qualify as exactly that, Shabbos Goy. They're taking the orders, cashing their checks, and drinking the kosher Kool-Aid. They're all being brainwashed. All of us are being brainwashed by these lies and getting us to fight their wars, to fight each other, and to do their bidding. But no, of course, all of that top-down approach, and looking to those who are dreaming these things up, who are, who are providing the incentives to everyone who's doing their bidding, lying to them constantly in order to get them to do their bidding. That logic, that sound and reasonable logic that would be applied to anyone, anywhere, at any time with anything they're doing wrong is suddenly anti-Semitic and off limits when it comes to Jews. Each of these individuals, namely the white ones, are to be held personally accountable without so much as a glimpse being taken up the ladder of power. So if a white person does something within this system, having been brainwashed his entire life, where he would have otherwise not had the thoughts, the opportunity, or the incentives to do these things, and when I simply point those things out, I'm racist and anti-Semitic, and I'm scapegoating, and the Jews will say that I sound just like a black person, blaming Whitey for all their problems. But that's my point, right? There is a reasonable argument that can be made if all of those things were true, if that black victimization, white supremacist system narrative were in fact a reality. Then yes, it would be understandable that if a group of people had been manipulated and used and abused and brainwashed and brought to a certain point and given incentives to do certain things, then those who are manipulating them are at least equally responsible for their actions, for the actions of any individual within that system, of course, right? But when it applies to reality here, where Jews, undeniably, if you look into these things, again, look it up, have had control over our system, and that includes everything from the medical industry, the media, the money, you name it, politics, the laws they're writing, everything else. But more specifically, and to the point here, the ability to manipulate us, to create a false reality, to put all this poison into our minds, to give us incentives to act like a dog in the dog-eat-dog world that they created. It stands to reason in the same way that, and I've made this analogy before, if I, as a father, took one of my children and put him or her in a bubble his entire life and only fed him the information that I wanted him to have, and he had no access to any other information, didn't know any better, and had no way of ever knowing any better, and I just conditioned him his whole life to think a certain way and ultimately to do certain things, would you hold him more equally or less accountable than me? I'm the one who had the malicious intent. I'm the one who had the ability to withhold knowledge from him, to put a bunch of bullshit in his head, leading him to do whatever it is that I wanted him to ultimately do. Of course, the brunt of the blame would be placed rightfully on me. So the same thing applies, or should apply, to Jews, or does apply, but not in the minds of the masses, and certainly not in the minds of the Jews themselves, who could never do any wrong. But, this is just another example, another illustration of the double standards, the hypocrisy, and the lack of accountability. So to move on to my next point here, that feeds into it, somehow the fat Jew sitting at the top, on top of everyone, is invisible, as attention is quickly deflected onto someone, anyone else, be that the Masons, the Illuminati, the Jesuits, some other ghost organizations, or Shabbos Goy. And it ultimately gets brought back full circle onto whites, the irony of it all. If any of us point at any Jew doing anything wrong, we're anti-Semitic first and foremost, because we're not supposed to take notice of these things, and we're certainly not to talk about them, let alone do the arithmetic and connect all the dots to all the other Jews that are Jewing us in so many other ways. But ultimately, it comes back full circle, and they turn the conversation back to this non-existent white supremacist bullshit. It's white supremacists, and that Jew is just one of many people who have done wrong, and most of the others who have done wrong are white. And they'll start pointing their fingers at their victims, essentially. I mean, even when it's undeniably Jews and a whole assortment of Jews from all directions Jewing us, the blame still falls on whites, especially those of us who dare speak the truth. We're the ones who are labeled Nazis, terrorists, and you name it, just for making simple observations, undeniable observations, just for quoting the Jews themselves, doing simple arithmetic. And anyone who even thinks of stopping them, just even mentioning the fact that they're robbing, enslaving, poisoning, and murdering us, is to be condemned. How dare we? How dare us lowly Gentiles even notice any of the things they are doing to us, saying about us, or planning on doing to our children? I want to get into the psychology of it, at least a little bit here, as far as the average person. And to my notes for a moment. People are lost. They have been brainwashed, chemically dumbed down, addicted, and poisoned, isolated, and turned against each other at every turn, over every conceivable difference. But the people who are manipulating them, writing the scripts, producing the films, teaching the lessons, editing the news, leading these movements, bringing in these immigrants, writing the laws, passing the bills, and signing the checks are somehow held above questioning. Again, nothing could be worse than an anti-Semitic individual who dares question God's chosen people. It's now illegal to do so in many of our countries, and here in the United States, they're passing bills where we're not allowed to boycott a foreign country. It's not Ireland, not Portugal, not Germany, not China, not any other country, but Israel is the only foreign nation that we are not allowed and can be and very shortly will be punished if we even think of boycotting them. You can boycott America as an American. You can boycott or even burn our flag, but you cannot boycott Israel. And if that doesn't say it all, I don't know what does. The media is silent on this agenda and the endless crimes against us, making those who control the media complicit. And the endless Jew writers, authors, directors, producers, and professors are as culpable as they could possibly be, with oceans of blood on their hands. Again, these Jews and the sheep have no problems whatsoever with falsehoods, projections, generalizations, or all-out attacks when it comes to whites. But the truth about Jews is forbidden, censored, and even prosecuted. We're not allowed to question the things that they do to us, the things that they have said that we or our ancestors have done, making thought a crime. Fact of the matter is, no race has suffered more than whites have suffered in one Jew-orchestrated war, revolution, famine, disease, or the other. But hey, let's not get out of our lane, hurt their feelings, recognize, generalize, or break their laws with any of those anti-Semitic facts. The average white, back to or getting to these points that I want to make here as far as the psychology behind it, where they have brought us as individuals and collectively as a people through the constant repetition of lies, this false guilt, and everything else that they've undeniably done to us since the time we were born, to include the chemical dumbing down, to include the poisoning, the vaccinations, the poisoning of our food, our water, our air, our everything. So the average white has now been molded into a sadistic, self-hating, self-deprecating, suicidally altruistic, and I'd even say in many instances, what's the word for it, auto-flatulent behavior, where they cause harm to themselves. And I'd even call them misanthropic. But the fact of the matter is, they don't hate the human race. They don't hate humankind. They just hate their own race, their own kind. And again, none of this stuff is natural. None of it's happening in a vacuum. But that's the state of mind that most whites are in today, have been brought to. That's the point we've been brought to. Hating ourselves so much that we ourselves, most of us at least, don't even believe that we have a place on this earth, because we've been taught that every problem the world has ever known was our fault. Basically, Jews projecting everything onto us. And seeing how we're altruistic and that we care more about others than ourselves, naturally, if we believe that, if we were made to believe that, as most of us were, and I'll say in past tense because I once believed it to a certain extent as well, and I'm sure most of you did, even if you can't remember that far back. At some point, you believe these things to some degree. And you felt bad. You felt bad. You felt like we owed something, at least something, to these people that we supposedly wronged. Their shortcomings, ultimately our fault. So, the effort to teach us these lessons was clear and obvious. We all heard them. We all went through the same indoctrination. And now that we can reflect back upon it, and now that we're looking into these things, we can see that all of these ideas, all of these lies, all of this projection, all of this hatred that we've been taught, hatred of ourselves, was all born in the mind of this Jew, that Jew, or the other. And it's all part of their white genocide agenda. Either way, and this is a little note to leftists, people who still believe these things. You, Mr. or Mrs. Lemming, you need to overcome your cognitive dissonance. The more committed you are to these lies that we've all been taught, and it's just a side note here, but these people actually believe that they're somehow on to something, that we're ignorant. We somehow miss these lessons in school. We somehow miss these endless movies and this white guilt narrative that is everywhere, that is inescapable, unavoidable, that we all had to, again, sit through in class and witness everywhere around us, from everyone's mouth, from all the programming. We've just been completely submersed in it all our lives. But these people somehow believe that we were taught our racism, our hatred, our anti-Semitism, and what do you do with a Nazi? You punch them. That's where they've taken this. But nevertheless, these people believe that they're onto something. They're edgy. That everyone else out there, or at least we, are ignorant, bigots, hateful for no reason, mindlessly blaming Jews, scapegoating Jews, and hating people because of the color of their skin or whatnot. But again, this stuff is pushed so hard and heavy out in the open, all throughout the mainstream, that these people need a reality check. One that they are, due to their cognitive dissonance, are not even opened up to. And that's the point that I was getting to here. The more committed these people are to these lies, the less likely they are to accept that they were duped. It wasn't easy for you or I to accept that we were duped, that we were once just as brainwashed as most of these people are, most of our people are, by the same lies, the same process, by the same people, of course. The rest of us took the same kosher bait, hook, line, and sinker as well, so we know how difficult it is to overcome such huge lies. And these lies are as big as they could possibly be, the exact opposite of reality in most instances. So, that's done for a reason. It fits into their agenda. It pushes their agenda forward, fits into their narrative that they've created. But the reason that they've taken it so far and told such big lies is because it makes it difficult, if not impossible, for the average person to overcome them. To think you've been told a little lie, you can accept that. But for the average person to accept that everything they've ever been taught and told and believe is a bald-faced lie that's a complete opposite of reality, yeah, that's very difficult, right? So there's a good benefit on the back end of them telling such huge lies, and that is that it brings people much further, the average person, much further from the truth, or from even opening themselves up to accepting any of these truths. So back to my notes here just for a moment. All of the psychological factors are involved in keeping the goyim, all of us, in line, and this all comes into play. You need to chalk it up as a mistaken judgment, true ignorance, and the result of a lifetime of brainwashing, where you would then redirect your anger towards those who have truly and deeply harmed you. That's what should be done. That's what some of us have, in fact, done. We chalked it up as a lesson. We were wrong, and now we'll never be duped again because we understand just how big these lies can be and just how far from reality we once were. So we're more open to questioning things than most people because we realize just how big these lies can be and how wrong we once were. But no, I digress, and I realize that most of you will actually and automatically double down on the insatiable and incurable hatred of all things white, to include yourselves, rather than accept that we've been lied on such a level, even though going back to the points that I made in the beginning, that things are wrong in this world, but you've been taught all your lives that it's the white man's fault, that it's white supremacists, and all these things that you cannot even begin to verify in reality. You cannot reconcile your beliefs with reality. But you will still double down on it and just view me as being some hateful, bigoted, racist, anti-Semitic Nazi, so on and so forth. Then what do you do to a Nazi? You punch him in the face and you put him down. That's the emotional reaction and response that we get from these people, and these are the reasons for it. Cognitive dissonance. They will double down on the bullshit that they've so blindly accepted, swallowed, and made, in the case of the social justice warriors, the basis, the foundation of their very existence, their purpose in life is based on bringing down this non-existent white supremacist system. So to accept that they've been duped, that they've been on the wrong side of things, and that the people that they so love are actually responsible for all the problems that they and everyone else is facing in the world today, it's too bitter of a pill to swallow, so they double down. And they'll hate me for telling them that, many of them at least, rather than getting on the right path and doing something positive, really truly fighting for peace and everything they believe they're fighting for now. Especially those of you who have mixed race kids and the like. Well, most of us at least, because I have mixed race kids. So, but I do understand, right? I understand the difficulty that lies therein. Once you have committed yourself to this anti-white, multi-culti, genocidal agenda, it's very difficult, if not impossible, for most people to look at themselves honestly in the mirror and realize that they were once so brainwashed to admit that they did things that were not only not in their own best interest, but that they ultimately did what these evil bastards wanted them to do, mindlessly, to an extent, right? And it doesn't take away from the love that we have for our children or the black neighbor, Tyrone or whatnot, the individuals that we know, our own experiences, things that mattered and still matter, and people that still matter to us. People it's hard to balance this, right? So it's very difficult, and I say this from personal experience, to balance these things. And in a way, you really can't. To accept the reality of the situation and the truth is to admit that you have done things that were wrong, a sin, or however you might view them now that you're aware. And there's no reconciling these things. There's no way of saying, yeah, that was a good thing. I did what these homicidal maniacs, these genocidal Jews wanted me to do. Again, good luck getting most people who have committed themselves to this multi-culti cult, knowingly or otherwise, or let's not say knowingly, let's say, voluntarily. Because when you're thrown into an environment like I was, where you were the only or one of very few whites around, and you're being taught all this white guilt and everything else, it's natural for an individual who's lost in a sea of multi-culti diversity, as well as all the brainwashing, to act in a certain way. It's not all that unpredictable. But nevertheless, I can tell you, again, from personal experience, it's not an easy transition or something that's easy to do, to look in the mirror. And I don't expect 99.99% of people to do what I've done and simply state the truth for what it is, accept it for what it is, state it for what it is, because it makes you look like a hypocrite, a fool, and so on and so forth. And again, most people just aren't willing to admit when they were wrong, not even to themselves. So the only point in that, it's not a confession. It's not to tell people something I haven't already said I don't know how many times before. But it's just to make the point that doing the right thing, stating the truth, the facts for what they are, is something that most people will not do, when they will not even admit these things to themselves, especially those who have, engaging in cognitive dissonance, and they've went down a certain path for so long, and they've committed themselves to a certain way of life, and they've been surrounded by, I won't say they surrounded themselves by, because I don't know of any whites, even liberals, who go looking to live in Africa or to go buy cheap property in a ghetto or whatnot. So even these liberal leftists don't put their money where their mouths are. They might stick around longer than they should, as my parents did, but then the children don't really have a choice, right? So in most instances, we don't have a choice. Turn the TV off. Don't have any friends. Live in a little bubble. That's about the only way you can escape the dogma, this anti-white narrative, this bullshit that they're pumping in our heads from all directions. It's pretty much unavoidable at this point in time. Even with my children, I try to keep them as isolated and protected from it as I possibly can. But I'm constantly, on a daily basis, having to correct things when they hear or see something from someone or on TV or wherever it is that they're being exposed to these things. They're class lessons, and we homeschool, but nevertheless, they're still reading books, and we have to make a very deliberate and concerted effort to right all of these wrongs. And everything, to some degree, needs to be corrected. Most things, as a matter of fact, are the complete, exact opposite of reality. So it's a very difficult task, even for those of us who are aware, and our children who have been protected as much as humanly possible. Anyways, to the final thought here. Nevertheless, all of the personal stuff and your feelings aside, whenever you are ready to stop living in complete denial, please look it up. As is the case with every other point in this video and with every other fact that I've ever shared or even briefly mentioned, don't take my word on it, look it up. Find out for yourself and at least try to prove me wrong. Calling me names and attacking me and calling me a Nazi, punching me in the face or putting me down like a dog, whatever, doesn't prove me wrong. It'll allow you to keep that cognitive dissonance going. It'll allow you to keep the dream alive, keep living a lie or whatnot. But that's it. It's just denial, nothing more. You will, without a doubt, if you look into these things, find that all of this insanity is happening under the watch of these Jews who undeniably sit atop of all of us, pulling all of the strings, pushing all the buttons, writing all of the scripts, signing all the checks, and laughing at us all. That's essentially what they're doing as we're fighting over nonsense, as we're chasing ghosts, looking in all the wrong directions. We don't understand ourselves as well as they understand us at this point in time. And it's a big joke to them. They're psychopathic and they enjoy watching us squirm under their lies, under their knives. Any opportunity they have to Jew us, they enjoy it. And they say so much openly. And again, look it up. Their confessions, their own words. And you'll see that everything I'm saying is true. And I can be anything that you want me to be. A racist, Nazi, terrorist, supremacist, bigot, a race mixer, I'm all the above, whatever you need to call me. But look into these things and you'll see that all of the problems in the world today and all the things you concern yourself with over the future, the shit's all happening on their watch. It's not the Nazis.